is my honor to introduce Aaron Rimler-Cohen from the Farm Sanctuary.
Hey, y'all. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I just want to thank Lenore and Piedmont one more time. An incredible work that they do, and we at Farm Sanctuary have 3 pillars: rescue, education, and advocacy. Changing lives, changing hearts and minds, and changing systems. And if you have questions about our rescue work, I will do my best to answer them, but also Lenore is the expert in the room. I'm our Senior Director of Advocacy and Education at Farm Sanctuary, and I very rarely add that MPP next to my name, but I'm really excited to be back on Duke's campus. I got my policy degree right across the street, and so it's great to be home. Just a little bit of an agenda, what to expect in this conversation. I'm going to make a case first for why the animal-centered movement and the vegan movement need to do more work to build bridges with other movements, whether farmer, environment, health, justice, or other organizations who are elevating food and integrating a concern for animals in factory farming. We're then going to talk about why a resource-based approach is important to food system transformation, what that can mean, the kinds of policies and legal advocacy that we see as maximally effective to not only benefit animals, but also people on the planet, because our well-being is interconnected. We are one collective, and the policies that we use to advance farmed animals also benefit the rest of us, and we want to make sure that we elevate that systematic change. And then we'll identify the Farm Bill and school food as critical opportunities for food system transformation coming out of that resource-based approach. And finally, we'll get into a little bit of a discussion around how sanctuaries embody this kind of meet you where you are approach. If I could quote Gene Bauer, our co-founder. A little bit about Farm Sanctuary. We were the first farmed animal sanctuary in the United States, founded in 1986. Gene actually funded Farm Sanctuary by selling vegan hot dogs outside of a Grateful Dead concert. And I know, it's amazing. I feel like if I were around in 1986, I would have been one of those people buying the vegan hot dogs. And to think of him as a visionary, going out there, meeting folks, talking about rescue, education, and advocacy at those tables, that's really the seed from which Farm Sanctuary grew, and it's those roots that we're attempting to get back to. So first, I want to make the point here that food matters to all of us. Whether you care about health, sustainability, vibrant rural and urban economies, social justice, or animal well-being, food is under-recognized and it's deprioritized both within our politics and within our social conversations. In the United States, diet-related disease remains the top cause of death, and diet-related illness remains a top driver of non-cancerous chronic pain. Regarding sustainability, 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems, but only 3% of public climate finance goes to food system interventions. By the way, you see little footnotes here. This is all pulled from a forthcoming roadmap that Farm Sanctuary is publishing, where we identify the lending, spending, and land ownership assets across the federal government and talk about how we can shift those resources to benefit all of us, animals, people, and the planet. In the United States, according to the Rockefeller Foundation, the costs to people and the environment are about $2.1 trillion if you believe that we can financialize them. As we heard in a previous conversation, a lot of policymakers like to hear a cost-benefit analysis. So one way of framing our food system failures is that our costs within our food system are about double their contribution to GDP. Here in North Carolina, if you identify as Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous, you are 54% to 118% more likely to live right outside of a CAFO, a confined animal feeding operation. And that's obviously a social justice issue, and it was done not by, it's not a mistake that happened. It's a representation of the structural challenges that we face, and the earlier presentation did a great job of highlighting how cost and regulations and the ways in which our laws actually support that social injustice. And then we also heard there are 9 billion chickens here in the United States and more than 10 billion farmed animals. And we also heard from the comment that between 90 and 99% of farmed animals live in factory farms, with chickens being those who live most commonly within factory farms. And I think it's also important to note that factory farming, animal agriculture in general, requires about 40% of the land in the contiguous United States. And also, if you add up all of the military bases, all of the national parks, it's about 80 million acres of federally owned land dedicated to those causes. There's about 240 million acres of federally owned land dedicated just to helping ranchers. So whether it's with the lending, with the direct spending, or with the land ownership, the federal government is deeply involved in helping to structure and perpetuate a system that's harming all of us, and we should all care about that. I also want to make the point that food interventions can have an outsized impact. So food isn't just important. Once you start to prioritize it and once you start to elevate it, food can actually have outsized benefits, and by implementing effective evidence-based food policies, we can make incredible strides in health, sustainability, economic, social justice, and animal well-being. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there are, for adults, annual reduced healthcare costs per person of $1,834 a year. So if a person is food insecure according to their measurements and they are made food secure, they can expect to spend about $1,800 less every year in healthcare expenses. Regarding sustainability, I think it's important to note that the way in which we count emissions in the United States is deeply flawed. So when the Environmental Law Institute did an analysis of how exactly does agriculture contribute to our food system emissions, they recognize that a lot of the petrochemicals, a lot of the land use transformation doesn't get counted into how the EPA calculates total emissions as a result of the food system. So the EPA actually underestimates food system emissions in the United States by about 67%, again, according to the Environmental Law Institute. Within our local economies, food can serve as an amazing multiplier. So nutrition and farm to school investments have among the highest multiplier of any policy in the country. That means for every dollar that you put into that policy, a local community or a local economy can expect between $1.50 and $2.10 in return. Again, these cost benefit analyses are important when we're talking to policymakers. And I think when we're talking about great policy, like getting fruits and vegetables that are grown in state into local schools, that's feeding two birds with one stone, right? We can grow our economy. I know, I had to do it. It's also important to recognize that food insecurity rates are not equal across our population. The food insecurity rates of those identifying as Black, Latino, or Indigenous were actually at pandemic levels prior to the pandemic. This is a long-term structural problem. You hear from Big Ag all the time. We're feeding the world. We're not even feeding folks in the United States of America. And that's a direct result of the ways in which we use our land and our money and our other resources to support industry and not to support farmers, not to support families, not to support local communities. And it's also important to recognize that if you care about wildlife, if you care about the broader animal ecosystem, and I'm so glad the Humane Society of the United States is here to talk today. I believe in a one animal approach. Sometimes I know we can get into little internecine squabbles around, farmed animals don't get enough attention. But at the end of the day, by addressing issues within animal agriculture and factory farming, we're benefiting wildlife, we're benefiting all animals across the globe. We're currently living in what some have referred to as a sixth mass extinction. A main driver of that is the phosphoric imbalances and land use transformations that drive animal agriculture and factory farming. And finally, it's important to recognize in this conversation around food mattering to everyone, why is it that we want to build a cross-movement approach? There are economists who will tell you, okay, Aaron, I get it. the food system. It's not great for people. It's not great for animals. It's not great for our shared environment. But at least we're economically efficient. And we're not. If we look at food system productivity in the United States from 2010 to 2019, if we look at the resources, so land, labor, capital, feed, and fertilizer, we put in more than we get out. And that's not true for any other country on the globe. So why is that the case? It's because we are subsidizing factory farms, we're subsidizing industry, we are not subsidizing farmers that nourish people, and we're not prioritizing outcomes for animals, people, and the planet. So where this conversation around why a cross-movement approach to animal advocacy matters is regardless of who you're talking to and regardless of what they care about, you can start with the question of like, what matters to you? And you can bring it back to food, and you can bring it back to the failures of animal agriculture and our factory farming system. And I think that's a more persuasive approach at the end of the day. I think it's an approach that can build a big tent. It's an approach that can bring more people to our side. And frankly, a lot of people, whether it's a policymaker's office or some of the stakeholders we work with, partners we work with, they expect me to come into the room and yell at them, because that's the conception that a lot of people have about vegans. It's that we're angry and we're going to throw some paint. And to be totally honest, I don't have a problem with throwing paint. We need radicals so that we can also have folks who dress up in suits every day and make change in a different way. We need complementary approaches to change. But I think on the whole, we can do a better job as a movement in meeting people where they are and in taking an evidence-based approach so that folks can realize what I care about is actually connected to the well-being of an animal. And that's an incredible realization for folks. So we talked a little bit about why cross-movement advocacy is important, how it can benefit us as a movement, build our power. I also now want to move on to the second part of our kind of theory of change here at Farm Sanctuary Advocacy and Education, which is taking a resource-based approach to food system transformation. And what I mean by that is rather than starting with the laws and the regulations, go to the biggest pots of whether it's land value, because the most important asset in the US food system is the land. It's not necessarily the crops that's grown. It's the fact that in order to get started as an Iowa feed farmer, you got to start with 2,000 acres. That's how it becomes financially viable. So land as an asset and as a resource is incredibly important. One statistic out there about land and the way in which land values are fueled by our federal investment. If you had invested in land as an asset class in 2003, it would have outperformed the S&P 500 by 33%. So folks are getting rich off US farmland while the rest of us aren't getting nourished and are being harmed in the process. So how exactly are we investing? What are the resources that go into our food system? The biggest bar here that you see here is actually lending. So a lot of times folks go directly for the spending. They talk about, oh, what are all the ways in which we're paying farmers directly? What are all the ways in which we're spending money in our schools to nourish our kids? But what they don't realize is we are deeply subsidizing the debt that farmers need to take out to create factory farms. And why is that important? Well, if I told you that you could get lower than inflation interest to buy a piece of farmland just as long as you do it for factory farming, you might not have been interested in factory farming to begin with, but you might say, yeah, okay, that sounds like a great way to turn a profit. That's why one of the biggest landowners for agriculture in the United States is Bill Gates. It's not because he wants to support factory farming, it's because the debt is subsidized, and then he makes money on the back end through the subsidies. And then it's also important to recognize within the animal-centered movement, we focus a lot on the funding that goes directly to factory farms. And I think that's critical. It's important to recognize that our insurance is subsidizing the profits of our largest farmers. But it's also critical to recognize that within the Farm Bill, most of the spending here is nutrition. Food service is not in the Farm Bill per se. That's like school food and military meals and that kind of thing. But both of these are actually much larger than the commodity and insurance payments. So if we want to take a resource-based approach and we want to say, let's go where the money is, let's shift the money to support animals, people, and the planet, I say let's start with the bigger bars, with lending, with nutrition, and with food service. Because this is an opportunity for us to take on factory farming where they're least expecting it. Their lawyers and their lobbyists, which get paid a heck of a lot more than ours, know exactly how to defend the insurance subsidies that are making their industries billions of dollars. What they don't know how to defend is a 10-cent a meal subsidy for school meals that grow in-state fruits, vegetables, and legumes. They twist themselves into knots saying like, oh, well, legumes is a replacement for animal protein, and they start to sound like the wackos. And that should be our goal. It should be for them to sound like the wackos in the room and for us to sound reasonable, realistic, and taking an evidence-based approach. So a little bit of more detail in terms of how this lending and spending gets broken down to subsidize the profits of the largest landowners. More than half of all Farm Credit System debt goes to the top 1%. Again, that debt helps them buy land that then helps them enjoy an asset class that the rest of us don't really have access to. And then 7 and 10 federal commodity dollars go to the top 7% of largest recipients. So what does this mean? It means that our food system reflects our broader economy in many ways. We're perpetuating inequality. We're supporting the top 1% to the top 7% of participants to the detriment of the rest of us. So I would encourage you, if you're talking to a state legislator, and they're telling you, well, hang on. Agriculture is one of the biggest industries in North Carolina. How could we attack it? What I'd love for you to say is, oh, I'm supporting the farmers, but right now the farmers aren't getting supported by the current policies. It's the lobbyists and lawyers and the industries that are getting supported and the largest landowners that are getting supported by the policies. Farmers are going out of business. Why are they going out of business? Because we built rules and regulations that don't support them. It's also important to recognize that most insurance spending supports industrial commodities, not food that directly nourishes people. So most of the insurance that you hear when you're talking about agriculture and our food system, the first thing to recognize is it's not disaster-based insurance. This is not, I had a hailstorm and now I need to be able to like feed my farming family. This is like the price of corn dropped by 25 cents and I need to be able to make the profit that I was assuming, so I'm going to go to the federal government. And the crops that are getting insured by this revenue-based insurance model, not disaster-based insurance model, are predominantly corn. And what does corn do in the United States? It's not the corn that you're eating, it's the corn that animals are eating on factory farms, and it's going into other industrial inputs. 90%, 80 to 90% of corn in the United States is not grown to nourish people, and that percentage is even higher when you look at what percentage of the corn that's subsidized is not going to nourish people. So again, we're spending a ton of taxpayer dollars to support the largest factory farms to grow food that's not nourishing people. So it should not be a surprise, the stats at the beginning of this presentation, that we are failing to achieve the outcomes that we might expect or hope for within our food system. It's exactly how we designed it. And again, the burdens are disproportionately felt by folks who have always felt the burdens in this country, the people who don't look like me, the people who don't sound like me, and the people who rarely get opportunities to talk at Duke Law. Right? The farmers who identify as black receive about half in federal government payments compared with those who identify as white. On a per acre basis, Indigenous and First Peoples receive about 40%. And when we're talking about landowners as the folks who are disproportionately benefiting, particularly agricultural landowners, who are disproportionately benefiting from the resources that we're investing in our food system, it's important to remember that 94% of land owners in the United States, agricultural landowners in the United States, identify as white, and then it's about 97% of the land is owned by folks who are white, identify as white. Then we can get into a conversation around conservation. So this graph is like very confusing. I have been told that I need to figure out a better way to communicate this, and maybe somebody can help me. But first, let's start with this purple line here, okay? This purple line is the return on investment, dollar for dollar, that you get for putting into a conservation program. And so we have EQIP, which is by far the largest conservation program in the United States, the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. And what you see is EQIP has the lowest return on investment, and the Conservation Stewardship Program has the highest return on investment. And by the way, when I'm talking about return on investment here, it's not just economic return on investment, it's economic, social, and environmental return on investment. So this is what's been deemed as what's best for our economy, but also what's best for our environment and our society. And you might be asking yourself, well, then why is it that we're investing more money in EQIP, a little bit more money in the Conservation Reserve Program, and way less money in the Farm Bill into the Conservation Stewardship Program? And I'll give you two reasons. Number one, EQIP requires, and this was true before the most recent emergency funding that came outside of COVID, and it's still true for the upcoming Farm Bill, EQIP requires 50% of its funding to go to animal agriculture. Well, it's really hard to build animal agriculture in a way that's environmentally sustainable. So what happens through these EQIP funding sources? What they're doing is they're not actually supporting what we call whole farm conservation. They're supporting individual activities that are considered conservation. So what does this mean in practice? What it means is the folks who are getting the insurance subsidies, the folks who are getting the subsidized debt, are also the folks who are getting paid to clean up their mess through our conservation spending. So when you hear, oh, the federal government increased conservation spending within agriculture by $2 billion, we should all salute a more environmentally sustainable food system. I agree. A more environmentally sustainable food system would be incredible. But why is it that we're paying factory farmers to clean up their mess, and we're not focused on what are called whole farm conservation programs, where we're actually looking at the overall environmental sustainability of the farm and asking them to improve overall their measures of success as it relates to building a more environmentally sustainable agricultural system? It's because of the lawyers and the lobbyists who get in there and say, well, we want to make sure that we're supporting our clients, the factory farms, and conservation spending is another great way that they can do it. So hopefully at this point, what I've convinced you of is a couple of things. Number one, no matter who you're talking to, you can meet folks where they are, you can elevate food, and you can integrate a concern for animals and factory farming. And number two, there are a ton of resources out there that go undiscussed and underdiscussed, and we need to pay more attention to and put more political pressure on being evidence-based and cost-effective. Because the facts are on our side. If we want to build a more environmentally sustainable, socially just food system, we're going to be doing a lot less animal agriculture. And what I like to say is that there are different folks who are going to get off on the vegan train at different steps along the way, right? Like for me, I would love to see a world with no animal agriculture. That is the mission of Farm Sanctuary. It's to end animal agriculture and foster just and compassionate vegan living. But I do that as a long-term struggle. When Gene Bauer founded Farm Sanctuary in 1986, that was almost 40 years ago. I think we've made quite a bit of progress, but I think we're still quite a ways away from ending animal agriculture. So what I think we need to do, or what I would suggest to y'all, is that we need to be promoting the kind of education that changes lives and changes hearts and minds and gets individuals to go vegan. But we also need to be advocating for structural reduction. And that structural reduction is important, even if it doesn't get all the way to the vegan utopia that I would like to live in. And by the way, if it's going to be a vegan utopia, it also has to work for people on the planet, right? This is about collective well-being, and it's about promoting outcomes that benefit all of us, animals, people, and the planet. So you might be asking me at this point, okay, this is all well and good, meet folks where they are. Let's go take this resource-based approach. how are we going to turn this into an action or a policy approach or a legal approach that I can be sure aligns with my values as wanting to promote veganism and plant-based living, but also accomplishes those goals of being mainstream seeming and moderate seeming, regardless of what my hair and beard suggest. What I would suggest is we need to talk a lot more about how not only food interventions can have an outsized impact, but also how plant-based interventions can have an outsized impact. And what we should be talking about, in my opinion, a lot more is not just all the folks who are getting harmed by the current system, the animals, people, and the planet, but also the ways in which we can build the good together. We can build a community that's better for your children and your grandchildren. We can use plants and plant-based foods to do it. So, for example, within health, plant-based diets are associated with reducing all-cause mortality risk of chronic pain, risk of diet-related disease. That's great. What we're seeing in hospitals across the country are more approaches to treating diabetes, treating some of these long-term concerns with produce prescription packages, using insurance money, which, by the way, is another huge resource, which could be on our side, using that insurance money to go buy fruits and vegetables. I think that's amazing. I think it's a kind of policy that can not only improve folks' health, but can also support the farmers who are growing those fruits and vegetables. Plant-based strategies for sustainability. As we talked about, most U.S. farmland and agrochemicals are used to feed animals, not people. When we're growing food, it's a much more efficient, much more effective way of nourishing people. It requires us to use a lot less land. And what I learned when I was working for a berry farm business out in Iowa, y'all are gonna laugh, I moved from Iowa to North Carolina, so it was like one CAFO capital of the world to the other. But when we were growing berries out in Iowa, what we found was we're actually increasing the soil, we're actually sinking carbon through perennial approaches. And that's the amazing thing about food when we want to think about it from the perspective of sustainability. If you're talking about fossil fuels and you're talking about energy consumption, almost always you're talking about reducing something bad. When we're talking about food and we're talking about plant-based production, we have the capacity to sink carbon. So it has this double effect that I think the environmental movement would be wise to take advantage of. We can also talk about plant-based strategies for economic gains. So a 9-state study of SNAP fruit and vegetable incentives found an up to $3 return in economic value for every dollar spent. So you remember $1.5 to $2.1 per dollar spent was the average return on investment for some of the key food policies that we highlighted. It turns out that when we limit those food incentives to fruits and vegetables, we can have an even stronger economic return. And that matters to the policymakers that we're trying to convince. And then finally, I'm not the best person to talk about this, but from my understanding and from the conversations I've had with allies across our movement, we have a massive problem with culturally appropriate menus, particularly in our schools, where our schools' food systems and our schools' menus were predominantly created by the USDA, which is mostly folks who look like me, and then also the parents and the PTA organizations who are the most active. And what we have an opportunity to do is recognize that lactose intolerance is something that impacts less than 20% of folks who identify as white, but 70 to 90% of folks who identify as Asian American, 80 to 100% of folks who identify as First Peoples, and disproportionately burdens folks who identify as Black or African American as well. So when we want to talk about building meal patterns that can be universally accessible, which to me should be the goal of our public food, is to build meal patterns that are universally accessible, we should be creating more plant-based and plant-forward options. What we've also learned is that hamburgers, chicken tenders, and these other food items that were certainly served in my school, may have been served in yours as well, aren't eaten in every single community across the country. And what we can also be focusing on is like maybe a bit more of a bean burrito, or a bit more of the kinds of meals that, again, can meet some of their students where they are. And when I had conversations with folks here in Durham Public Schools, the stories are tragic. We're talking about folks who say that like they have to drink milk for lunch because, again, milk is mandated by the USDA, dairy cow's milk, not just soy, almond, oat milk, but dairy cow's milk is mandated by the USDA. And there are students here in Durham, North Carolina, who told me that they are drinking that milk and then they throw up the next period. How are you going to learn? How are you going to achieve the educational outcomes that you want to achieve through our school system if we're feeding food to folks that their bodies can't process? And again, this is an opportunity within the animal and vegan-centered movement to present a choice. It's them who are mandating dairy cow's milk. And I'll tell you what, I went down to Alabama and I told them, should the federal government be telling you what you are feeding your children? Heck no! And it's a believable argument because they start to realize like, oh yeah, these massive government programs aren't here to benefit me. And rather than talking about cuts, we can talk about shifts. We can talk about shifts that are more effective for all of us, animals, people, and the planet, and that give local communities a bit more choice over how they're nourishing themselves. So I just want to, as we're wrapping up this segment of the presentation, highlight 2 farm sanctuary novel bills that we've written, one at the federal level, one at the state level in New York State. At the federal level, we're working on 30-cent cash back for SNAP fruit and vegetable purchases everywhere. So y'all might be familiar with the Double Up Food Bucks program, which is where you get to go to your local farmer's market, and if you're on SNAP, you get to, if you spend $1 on fruits and vegetables, you get $1 back, basically, and it's a great program. But the original pilot project that SNAP Double Up Food Bucks program actually came from was a statewide 30-cent cash back for fruits and vegetables program. And what we found was 30 cents is actually enough to encourage way more fruit and vegetable consumption. And what we've also found over the last 10 years or so of implementation of Double Up Food Bucks across the country, and what should have been obvious to anyone who's ever talked to a lower income person in their life, is that most folks who are on SNAP don't shop at farmers markets. In fact, most people who are on SNAP don't have grocery stores in their local community that they can access. Right? Part of food insecurity, as we measure it by the USDA, is geographic proximity to local fruits and vegetables. So our bill, which we call the National GusNIP Expansion Act, which hopefully, knock on wood, we will be introducing with Representative McGarvey out of Kentucky, would actually create a 30-cent cashback program for anyone in the country, no matter where you are, where you shop. And that's important. Kentucky, by the way, is important, not just because my family's from the University of Kentucky and I'm still mourning my loss. I know y'all want to, et cetera. But Kentucky's also important because there are 21 states in the country models to promoting plants and plant-based foods to build the good for all of us. GROW is an incredible organization. I recommend you looking them up. I was recently named to the board of the Green Rural Redevelopment Organization, and what we found in terms of a return on investment out of that $100,000 is in the first 13 months, we got 20x, so 20 times that, about $1.2 million $2.2 million, my brain, it's a Saturday, I'll just blame it on that, of private capital to jump in with Farm Sanctuary's $100,000 investment. And why is it that these other organizations wanted to jump in? It's because organizations like Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation of North Carolina and others recognize that plants and plant-based foods are not just great for people, for animals, for our shared environment, it's also great for these insurance companies' bottom line. And so we have an opportunity, in my opinion, to highlight and work with the great community-driven change makers who are working here in North Carolina, and you heard from one of them here today. I told Lenore before I got speaking that, like, I wish that all farmed animal sanctuaries, ours included, live to the standards that they live to. And it's incredible. They do incredible work. She said, like, you can visit. You could also donate. You could also donate if you can. It's really useful. I'll plug that one again for you. And I think that what you heard in that presentation was like a real meet you where you are approach, where you've got visitors, you're coming in, you're changing hearts and minds one by one, and you're having conversations that matter, and you're helping people get on that vegan train. And I think it's an incredible model. I am lucky to learn from and serve under Gene Bauer, our co-founder, who consistently reminds me and all of us that we have an opportunity through this kind of cross-movement approach to reach out, build stronger bonds. And when I think about building the good, I really do think that's the ethos of the sanctuary movement in a lot of ways. Like what we were building and what y'all are building is a space outside of extraction, outside of exploitation, where animals and farmed animals can live lives that are much closer to being fulfilling and the agency that they deserve. And it really is building a space that's good in a system that causes so much harm. And so when we think about how do we use our resources to build the good, I really do believe that sanctuaries are folks we can look to. And what I think we need to do a lot more of is taking that sanctuary ethos and bringing it to the system level. Because as y'all mentioned, we can't rescue everybody. But what we can do are build systems that ultimately make it such that animals are no longer used for the purposes of nourishing people. And in the process, we can nourish everybody and we can support a sustainable living environment for our next generation. And I think that for me, that triple outcome is ultimately what we should be searching for within our food system. And yes, also building an economically efficient food system that creates money for people to live, because it's not just what the policymakers care about. It's also when you talk to EFOD, the Equitable Food Oriented Development folks, which is this amazing 12-organization coalition of predominantly Black and brown-led groups. What they say is wealth building is incredibly important to our community, and food entrepreneurship, and these kinds of investments are critical for wealth building for us. And so we have to recognize that the economists occasionally have a point. We just listen to them way too often. So you can reach out to Farm Sanctuary at info@farmsanctuary.org. You can get involved with GROW, the Green Rural Redevelopment Organization, again in Henderson, North Carolina, 45 minutes up the road. And you can also reach out to me. I gave you my personal email because I've been at Farm Sanctuary for 3 years. And this is like a very bittersweet conversation for me to be having because I'm in my last 2 weeks here at Farm Sanctuary. It was my choice, I promise. I can't express to you enough how grateful I am to the presenters, those who have gone before, the water keepers to come, for being a part of this Big Tent Coalition. And I am so grateful to you all for spending time on your Saturday to learn, to think about how to get more involved and how to make choices, not just at the individual level to change lives and hearts and minds, but also how we can work collectively to change systems. Thank you very much.
Question for you, Aaron. Do you use Reddit?
Do I use Reddit? Yeah, occasionally.
Yes. Do you know Data is Beautiful, the subreddit?
Oh, yes.
Have you ever posted any of your recipes?
You know, my data isn't beautiful. I think it leads to beautiful conclusions, but I need help with the whole visual design process, I think, to get there.
I can help you out with that. So I've been using Data is Beautiful, and some of the stuff you have, the subreddit has 20 million people on it. So even if it doesn't do as well as you'd like, you'd still probably get 500,000 or 1 million people to view this data. So you're talking about how important it is to educate people, getting this data that you already have, spicing it up a little bit, and then putting it on there can get a ton of people to see it.
I love that. I'm super excited about it. Let's touch base afterwards. Yeah. I'm good at a very limited subset of things. Go on.
Do you know what's next for you after Farm Sanctuary?
Yeah. So I'm serving on the board of directors for Grow. I'm serving as a consultant for Farm Sanctuary and for a couple other organizations within the animal-centered and food system transformation space. And I am taking a step back because this work is really hard. And I feel like right now where I'm at in my life, over the last couple of months, haven't felt like I've been able to give it my all for the animals, people, and the planet in the way that they deserve. And also it turns out that people are willing to pay me to consult, which feels like a good way to keep one foot in the water. And yeah, if y'all know good folks who want free labor, if you're a great cause, or if you're Tyson, I'll take all of your money and shift it to animal-centered causes. Yeah.
Just first of all, thanks. That was a really articulate and thoughtful talk, and I really like the focus on building the good and bringing a lot of different parties to move the whole system. I was really curious. You talked a couple times about insurance, and it's great that Blue Cross Blue Shield is really keen on participating in these systemic changes that focus sort of small-scale agriculture and less factory farming. In terms of thinking about the farm subsidies for corn, are you getting insurance company buy-in on those kind of revisions, or is that more of an uphill fight?
Yeah, so I think it's more of an uphill fight, but mostly because these agricultural insurance companies their rules and their regulations are predominantly governed by the federal government, and also they're getting a ton of money to do exactly what they're doing now, which is that revenue-based protection. And unfortunately, insurance and crop subsidies and some of what we're talking about here, it really is a government problem that requires government solutions. And there are some in agricultural insurance companies that I think are finding a middle ground who are benefiting folks. Basically, if you ever want to look up an amazing agricultural insurance program that started out in the federal government and now exists in every county in the United States, it's called whole farm insurance. It's a revenue-based model, but it's whole farm, and it benefits predominantly folks who are growing diversified crops. So like you have blueberries, and you also have strawberries, and you also have barley. And so that's a great model, the whole farm revenue-based insurance model. But right now, when you're talking about tackling some of the insurance challenges within agriculture, that starts with changing the rules and regulations. Yeah.
So your talk kind of elucidated for me the nested doll, the broken nested dolls of the food system, and how there's just so many layers that are so warped and don't really contribute to the benefit of animals, the planet, or people. One thing that I was thinking about the kind of focus of existing agricultural systems on either raising animals directly for slaughter or growing food for those animals. And some of those foods are not even consumable, even if we wanted to. Thinking about the transition that might take a just and effective transition for all of those farmers who are exploited themselves to kind of better contribute to our shared kind of end goals. And I was wondering, are there any models or examples of that transition that's taken place? I know it's kind of starts with changing the hearts and minds of consumers in a lot of ways because money moves, people. But I'm just wondering if you had any insight on that.
Yeah, so first I would point you to Mercy for Animals Transformation Project, which is an incredible program that has helped farmers transition predominantly from poultry to mushrooms. I think there was a great article in The Guardian, in The Atlantic, if you want to learn more about MFA's transformation program. And then this relates back to the other question about what I'm doing next. Over the next 6 to 12 months, part of my next big project is to try to imagine the ways in which a real estate investment trust can catalyze and scale those kinds of transitions, because MFA's program and their work is amazing, but it also would require government funding to scale these transitions. And we've seen that happen in the past. We've seen tobacco farmers receive government funding so that they can transition to other forms of agriculture. Excuse me. But we also, in my opinion, need, not just because of the urgency of our challenges, but also because of the viability of political change at this moment in time, we need opportunities for vegans and animal-centered folks to put their money where their mouth is, because that's part of what we're so good at as consumers, as investors. And when we're talking about land being the most important asset within the food system, my contention and the contention of others who are working with me on this kind of project is that we can use a real estate investment trust model to buy land, shift land, and do so in a way that ultimately shifts resources to the community-driven organizations that have been affecting change for decades, often without the support of governments or institutions or organizations like mine.
There's also the Ranchers Advocacy Program by Rowdy Girl Sanctuary, Renee.
Yes.
So, and there, I think there's another one, I can't think of the name of it right now, but there are a couple of groups that I tag quite frequently that can help ranchers transition out of, and for people that don't know, her husband was a rancher. She married him and decided she didn't want to see these animals go to slaughter. She bought the cows from him because he couldn't afford to go out, and now they have a sanctuary in Texas. So she does have that added sort of, trying to think of.
No, you're exactly right. That lived experience, right?
Yeah.
That is, and she's incredible. I really appreciate you elevating her, especially doing that work in Texas.
Yeah.
What she faces is tough. It's difficult, but she's an amazing advocate. And I think there are, like you said, several organizations that are focusing on the question of how do we transition farmers and what is the technical needs that we need to go into transitioning farmers. But what I learned when I was working for that farm business out in Iowa was we had helped start or transition close to 300 farms from Oregon to Kentucky, all doing dairy farm production. But what we learned was the transition is actually the beginning, it's not the end. We don't have a food system and we don't have a market that supports farmers who are growing the right crops for the right reasons. And what we need to think about is how do we get more resources to support the models that Rowdy Girl and MFA and others are promoting.
I think that's good for time. Awesome. Thank you so much.